Hey everyone, welcome back. We're going deep today into a topic that really kind of bends your mind a little bit. It's the neuroscience of mystical experiences. I know it sounds a little paradoxical, right? Can science even measure something like a mystical experience? Something so intangible.
Well, that's what we're going to try to find out today.
Yeah, that's exactly what we're here to explore. And the really cool thing is we've got some amazing research to work with.
Yeah, we do.
And we're going to be looking specifically at the work of neuroscientist Dr. Mario Beauregard. Now, he's done some really groundbreaking studies with Carmelite nuns
That's right.
who volunteered to have their brains scanned while they were experiencing mystical states. Now, before we go too far, can you maybe set the stage for us a bit? Like, what were these studies actually like?
Sure.
I mean, were these nuns meditating in these big, fancy, high-tech brain scanners?
Well, not quite meditation as you might picture it. The nuns actually used a technique called recollection. And this is where they would essentially relive their most powerful mystical experience. So it's not just remembering it, it's more like stepping back into that moment
Well,
with all their senses
were they
fully engaged.
So they weren't trying to induce like a new mystical experience. They were trying to tap into something powerful from their past.
Exactly.
Okay.
And to really see what was happening in their brains during these recollections, Beauregard used two different methods. fMRI, which maps brain activity, and then something called QEG, which analyzes brainwave patterns.
Okay, I have to admit, QEG is a new one for me. Can you break that down a little bit more? What exactly does it measure?
Sure. QEG stands for quantitative electroencephalogram. It's basically a way of looking at the electrical activity in the brain. You've probably heard the term brain waves before. While QEG measures those waves, and it gives us a really detailed picture of what's happening in different parts of the brain.
Interesting. So fMRI is showing where the activity is happening, and QEG is showing the types of brain waves. So Beauregard had this like really comprehensive view of what was going on in the nuns' brains. But he didn't stop there.
Right. No, he did.
I mean, he also wanted to understand like the subjective experience.
Absolutely.
Like, what were the nuns actually feeling and perceiving during these mystical states?
Yes, and to measure that, he used something called Hood's mysticism scale. And this is a way of quantifying the intensity of mystical experiences. And then he also conducted really in-depth interviews with the nuns to get their personal descriptions of what they were going through.
That's what I find so compelling about this. It's
Yeah.
not just about the objective data. It's about understanding the whole experience.
Mm.
So from the actual results of the studies, what really stood out to you?
Well, one of the most significant findings, I think, is that there's no single God spot in the brain like some people might believe. Mystical experiences are much more complex than that. They involve multiple brain regions.
So it's not like flipping a switch. It's more like an entire orchestra playing right.
Yeah, precisely. And different regions were engaged depending on the specific qualities of the experience. For example, areas like the inferior parietal lobule, which helps us distinguish between ourselves and the outside world, showed decreased activity. And this might explain that feeling of a dissolving sense of self that a lot of people describe during mystical experiences.
That makes sense. Now, what about the feeling of connectedness to something greater than yourself? Like, what's happening in the brain during those moments?
Well, that's where areas like the prefrontal cortex, which is involved in higher order thinking and self-awareness, come in. Also, the limbic system, which processes emotions. And these regions showed increased activity, suggesting that mystical experiences involve not just a dissolving of the self, but also a heightened sense of connection and emotional intensity.
So all these different parts of the brain are working together to create this complex experience.
Mm.
Did the study show any differences between like recalling an everyday memory and reliving this mystical experience?
Yeah. Absolutely, and that's a key point, because it really challenges the idea that religious experiences are just heightened emotional responses. When the nuns recalled everyday memories, the patterns of brain activity were distinctly different from when they were in that mystical state.
So there's something unique happening in the brain.
Ah.
During these mystical experiences, that sets them apart from other states of consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what about the content of these experiences? Did the nuns describe any common themes or sensations?
Yeah, they did. The nuns consistently reported this profound sense of union with God, a feeling of overwhelming love, peace, and fullness. Some also describe sensory experiences like seeing light or hearing sounds. There's actually this really interesting anecdote about Sister Nicole.
Oh, yeah. Tell me about Sister Nicole. I read about how she heard music during her experience. It sounds almost like a hallucination.
Yeah, it's fascinating because it wasn't just any music. She specifically heard Pachelbel's canon. And what's remarkable is that she wasn't just remembering the music. It was like she was hearing it in real time, even though it wasn't actually playing.
Wow. Do you think her brain was creating this auditory experience based on a past memory?
It's possible. It seems like the line between recollection and the present moment was blurred during these mystical states. The brain was drawing on memories and sensory information, but also creating something entirely new in the process.
It really challenges how we typically think about perception and reality, doesn't it?
Yeah.
If our brains can generate these vivid, multisensory experiences, what does that tell us about consciousness itself?
That's a great question. And it brings us to another intriguing finding from Beauregard's research, the role of theta waves. Remember how we talked about QEEG measuring brain waves?
Yeah.
Well, during the mystical states, the nuns showed a significant increase in theta wave activity.
I'm actually familiar with theta waves
Mhm.
from my own meditation practice. They're often associated with deep relaxation and altered states of consciousness, right?
You're exactly right. Theta waves are prominent during deep meditation, REM sleep, and even hypnotic states. And Beauregard's research suggests that they may also play a key role in facilitating mystical experiences.
So we're seeing this clear connection between these profound spiritual experiences and brain states that are also associated with things like meditation, creativity, and even healing.
Exactly. And this connects to a broader body of research that suggests that theta waves may be like a gateway to accessing different levels of awareness and even tapping into unconscious material.
This is all incredibly mind-blowing. But I'm curious what this research means for the bigger picture. Does it prove or disprove the existence of God?
Well, that's where things get tricky. Neuroscience can't offer definitive answers about the nature of ultimate reality. But what it can do is illuminate the neural mechanisms that underlie these profound human experiences.
So while we can't say for certain whether these experiences are real in like an objective sense, we can study how the brain creates and interprets them.
Exactly.
I'm also curious about Beauregard's personal perspective. I mean, he's not just a detached observer. He's openly talked about his own mystical experiences, right? He had this profound experience where he felt this merging with what he calls cosmic intelligence, this sense of interconnectedness with everything in the universe. I'm wondering how that experience has shaped his scientific perspective. Do you think it informs his approach to studying consciousness?
I think it absolutely does. He often critiques purely materialistic views of consciousness, arguing that they're just inadequate to explain the richness and depth of our inner lives. He even goes so far as to say that consciousness is a fundamental property of the universe itself, a concept that he calls the divine ground of being.
Okay, now we're really getting into the philosophical weeds here. Can you unpack that idea of a divine ground of being a little bit further?
Sure, I think it'll be helpful to explore this concept and how it challenges traditional views of consciousness and spirituality, and I think we'll have time to get into that after a quick break.
Sounds good. Let's take a short pause, and when we come back, we'll
Yeah.
dive deeper into Beauregard's non-materialist perspective. Okay, so we're back, and before the break, you were going to kind of elaborate on this idea of a divine ground of being.
Right.
It definitely seems like a departure from traditional scientific thinking.
It is, and it's a concept that's really at the heart of his non-materialist perspective. So essentially, he envisions this divine ground of being as the ultimate source of both the physical and the psychological realms. Imagine it like the soil from which everything grows. Both the material world that we experience and the inner world of our thoughts and emotions and consciousness.
So it's not a god in the traditional, like, personified sense, but more like an underlying principle or energy that permeates everything.
Exactly. It's more of a fundamental ground of existence from which everything arises, including our individual minds and selves. And he suggests that mystical experiences might be moments where we kind of tap into this underlying interconnectedness, where the boundaries between self and other dissolve, and we get a glimpse of this deeper reality.
It makes you wonder if we're all connected at this fundamental level. What are the implications for how we live our lives, how we relate to each other, even how we view our place in the universe?
Those are exactly the questions Beauregard wants us to think about. He argues that clinging to this purely materialistic worldview really limits our understanding of who we are and what we're capable of.
But some people might argue that science, by its very nature, has to be materialistic, that it's all about studying the observable, the measurable world. What would you say to that?
Well, Beauregard would argue that science needs to evolve, that it needs to expand its methods and its framework to include the study of consciousness itself. You see, he sees the current scientific paradigm as being too reductionist, too focused on breaking things down into their smallest parts, and missing the bigger picture.
So it's not about throwing out the scientific method altogether. It's about refining it, making it more inclusive of subjective experiences and inner realities.
Right. It's about integrating what we've learned from studying the material world with the insights that we gain from exploring the inner world of consciousness. He's calling for a more holistic approach that acknowledges the limitations of purely objective observation.
Which makes sense. I mean, after all, we experience the world through our consciousness. It's the lens through which we perceive everything.
Exactly. And Beauregard would say that we can't truly understand the nature of reality without understanding the nature of consciousness itself.
Do you think this is a radical idea within the scientific community? I mean, is there an appetite for this kind of paradigm shift?
It's definitely challenging the status quo, but I think there's a growing movement within science, particularly in fields like neuroscience and quantum physics, that's recognizing the need to go beyond that purely materialist framework. I think there's a sense that we're on the cusp of a major breakthrough in our understanding of consciousness, and Beauregard's work is certainly contributing to that shift.
It's exciting to think that we might be on the verge of this new scientific era, one that embraces the mystery and wonder of consciousness, along with the rigor of scientific inquiry.
I agree, and I think this shift has the potential to transform not just science, but also how we approach things like healthcare, education, even our relationship with the planet.
That's a great point. If we start to acknowledge the interconnectedness of all things, like Beauregard suggests, it naturally leads to a more holistic and compassionate approach to life in general.
Yeah,
It makes you rethink everything, from how we treat each other to how we interact with the environment.
exactly. It shifts our focus from individual gain to collective well-being. It encourages us to see ourselves as part of something much larger than ourselves.
This has been an incredible deep dive so far. I mean, we've gone from brain scans to theta waves to the very nature of reality. It's fascinating, but also raises so many questions. So what are your thoughts on how Beauregard's work fits into this broader debate surrounding science and spirituality?
That's where things get really interesting. Because Beauregard, with his background in neuroscience and his own personal mystical experiences, he kind of finds himself right in the middle of this often heated debate.
It seems like he's trying to build a bridge between these two worlds that are often seen as being in conflict.
He is, and he does it by challenging assumptions on both sides. He critiques materialistic science for its inability to fully account for the subjective experience of consciousness, but he also challenges religious dogma that relies on blind faith and rejects scientific inquiry.
So he's advocating for a middle path, one that honors both the rigor of scientific investigation and the depth of spiritual insight.
Exactly. He's proposing a way of understanding the world that integrates the best of both approaches, recognizing that each has something valuable to offer.
Do you think he's optimistic about the possibility of bridging this divide between science and spirituality?
I think he is. He believes that as science continues to explore the nature of consciousness, it will inevitably encounter the spiritual dimension. And he sees this as a positive development, one that has the potential to lead to a more profound understanding of ourselves and our place in the cosmos.
It's an inspiring vision, one that suggests that science and spirituality,
Yeah.
rather than being at odds, can actually complement and enrich each other. I'm curious, where does Beauregard see this all leading? What does he envision for the future of humanity?
Well, he believes that we are in the midst of a spiritual evolution, a shift in consciousness that's moving us toward a greater understanding of our interconnectedness and our potential to create a more just and harmonious world.
Okay, now that's a concept I want to unpack further. What does he mean by spiritual evolution? And what does he see as the driving forces behind this shift?
That's a great place to pick up after a quick break. We'll delve into Beauregard's vision for the future of humanity and how we can contribute to this spiritual evolution.
Okay, so we're back and ready to really explore this whole idea of a spiritual evolution. Like, what does he mean by that?
It's a pretty fascinating concept, and it builds on that idea of the divine ground of being we were just talking about. He believes that humanity is on this journey of awakening to this deeper reality, recognizing our interconnectedness and moving beyond the limitations of a purely materialistic worldview.
So it's not just about like individual spiritual growth. It's about a collective shift in consciousness.
Yeah, exactly. He sees it as a gradual unfolding of human potential, a movement towards greater compassion, wisdom, and a sense of unity with all things. And he believes that this evolution is not just a possibility, it's actually happening right now, driven by a bunch of different factors.
Okay. That's actually a helpful thought,
Yeah.
especially in a world that often feels so divided and chaotic. So what are some of the factors that he sees as contributing to this shift?
Well, he points to the increasing interconnectedness of our world through technology and globalization. We're more aware than ever before of the challenges facing humanity as a whole, like climate change and social injustice. And this is fostering a sense of shared responsibility.
Right. It's like we're realizing that we're all in this together,
Yeah.
that our individual actions have global consequences.
Exactly. And he also sees the growing interest in things like mindfulness, meditation, and Eastern spiritual traditions. As evidence of this shift, people are actively seeking ways to connect with something beyond just the material world, to find meaning and purpose in a world that can often feel pretty shallow and consumeristic.
Yeah, there's definitely a hunger for something more, like a longing for a deeper sense of connection and meaning.
Yeah.
But if this spiritual evolution is happening, why doesn't it always feel that way? I mean, the world can still feel pretty dark and divided at times.
That's true. And Beauregard acknowledges that this evolution is not a linear process. There will be setbacks, there will be resistance, and even moments where it feels like we're moving backwards. But he believes that the overall trajectory is towards greater awareness, compassion, and unity.
Okay, so it's like any evolutionary process. There are going to be periods of rapid change and periods of relative stability,
Yeah.
but the underlying direction is towards greater complexity and interconnectedness.
Exactly. And he really emphasizes that we each have a role to play in this evolution. It's not something that's just happening to us, it's something that we're co creating through our choices, our actions, and our ways of being in the world.
So we're not just passive observers, we're active participants in shaping the future. So what can we actually do to contribute to this spiritual evolution? I mean, is it just about meditating more and being kind to each other?
Well, those are definitely important. But Beauregard offers a much broader framework for cultivating what he calls spiritual intelligence. He outlines several key practices that can help us expand our awareness, deepen our compassion, and really live more meaningful and purposeful lives.
I'm all ears. What are some of these practices?
Well, he starts with some of those foundational practices that we talked about earlier, things like meditation, mindfulness, and spending time in nature. These practices help us to quiet the mind,
Yeah.
to connect with the present moment, and tap into that deeper sense of interconnectedness.
I know for me personally, even just a few minutes of meditation each day makes a huge difference in how I feel.
It's not just about those formal practices, though. He also emphasizes the importance of bringing mindfulness into our everyday lives, paying attention to our thoughts and emotions and actions throughout the day, cultivating a sense of awareness and intentionality in everything we do.
So even simple things like washing the dishes or having a conversation with a friend can be an opportunity for spiritual growth if we approach them with awareness and presence.
Exactly. And he also encourages us to cultivate things like compassion, gratitude, forgiveness, and a sense of service to others. These aren't just moral virtues. He sees them as essential qualities for fostering spiritual intelligence and contributing to this evolution of consciousness.
He's really weaving together personal growth, spiritual practice, and ethical action.
Yeah, and he sees them as different facets of the same process, different expressions of this unfolding spiritual intelligence.
This is really inspiring, but it also feels like a lot to take in. Like, where do we even begin?
He emphasizes that it's not about trying to do everything at once. It's about starting where we are, choosing one or two practices that resonate with us, and gradually integrating them into our lives.
It's a journey, not a destination. It's about taking small steps, being patient with ourselves, and trusting that the process will unfold naturally.
Right. And he also stresses the importance of finding support along the way. Connecting with like-minded people who share our values and aspirations. This could be through spiritual communities, meditation groups, or even just having close friends who are also on a path of growth and exploration.
It's so important to have that sense of community.
It is. It's about recognizing that we're not alone in this. We're all in this together.
Well, this deep dive has been truly mind-expanding. We've covered so much from the neuroscience of mystical experiences to the very nature of consciousness and the future of humanity. I feel like I have a whole new perspective on what it means to be human and the incredible potential that lies within each of us.
I agree. And I think Beauregard's work offers this really powerful vision of the future, where science and spirituality, instead of being at odds, can work together to create a more compassionate, just, and sustainable world.
That's a great vision. And as we wrap up today, I want to leave you with a question. If, as Beauregard suggests, mystical experiences are a natural human capacity, what does that really tell us about the true nature of reality and our place within it? Is there more to the universe than we can currently perceive? And if so, how can we cultivate the awareness and the openness to tap into these deeper dimensions of experience? It's something to reflect on, to explore in your own life. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and we'll see you next time.